wrestling. For some reason, pro wrestling just seems to go with video games. I don't know if it's because both tend to be things that people started enjoying as kids, so it somehow gets intertwined in the psyche, but there is clear overlap between the two. Every year at the Midwest Gaming Classic in Milwaukee, a local indie promotion will set up near the vendor section and run multiple cards over the weekend, and even a few weekends ago at the comparatively younger Southern Fried Gaming Expo in Atlanta, they had a ring set up in one of the ballrooms for performances on the Friday night of the show. And honestly, I shouldn't be too surprised by that, but I'll admit, there was some serious cognitive dissonance at the thought of an indie promotion setting up in the ballroom of one of the nicest hotels that I've ever been in. Ironically, pro wrestling is also intrinsically tied to Zilog and Moto, as Pro Wrestling, the Master System game that I just can't seem to get away from, even almost after 300 episodes, was the first game that I ever reviewed for the channel. Now, why did I pick that to be the first game reviewed? Honestly, I don't know, but I think it may have had something to do with that goofy cover art that I complain about every chance I get. So in that regard, even though I do my best to drag it, the art worked and made the game stand out amongst all of the other possible choices. But aside from the cover, I'll admit to being an on-again, off-again wrestling fan since I was probably 8 years old. So I think I was curious to see what Sega would do with a pro wrestling-based game from that era. Now, I'm not going to rehash that review here. I'd recommend that you go watch that review if you want more details and maybe have a historical look at the beginnings of the channel, but I specifically remember it being a decent effort, especially compared to pro wrestling on the NES. And if you had any doubts, no, those are not the same game. However, I should probably pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are now confused because you didn't realize both the NES and the Master System had games named Pro Wrestling. What can I say? The 80s were a simpler time, and generic titles were all the rage. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where I'd also like to remind everyone the 80s were 40 years ago. Feel free to pause the video and call your local cemetery and reserve a plot now. Anyway, I'm about to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. Okay, I know I've rambled a bit in this intro, so let's get to the subject of this week's video, which is what's arguably Sega's follow-up to Pro Wrestling, Wrestle War. I say follow-up there because even though they don't look the same or have similar names, Pro Wrestling was actually a port of the arcade game Body Slam, and both Body Slam and the arcade version of Wrestle War were designed by Sega game designer producer extraordinaire Hiroshi Eso. So there is a little more connecting the games besides just that they were both published by Sega and being about pro wrestling. As mentioned, Wrestle War was originally an arcade title on the System 16 platform before being ported to the Mega Drive. And yes, I did say Mega Drive and not the Genesis. Now, why did we not get Wrestle War in the US? And did North American gamers miss out on something here, or were they better off not knowing the game existed? We'll try to answer both of those questions, but first a look at this imported package. And here's my copy of Wrestle War, again specifically for the Mega Drive, not the Genesis. And even more specifically, this is the PAL version that was released in Europe and Oceania, and not the Japanese release. That will make more sense in a minute. I've had this one for a few years now, picked it up in a bundle with some European Master System titles on eBay. This particular copy is in decent shape. It's definitely not perfect in that there's a small gouge at the top on the front, and that there's also some edge wear at the top on the inner cover, but other than that, this is a pretty solid copy. No water damage or sun bleaching, and the hang tab is intact at the top. This is a relatively inexpensive title as imports go, with copies selling for $20 and under, so if you come out of this review wanting one, they're definitely out there to be had. As far as the front cover art goes, here's where things start to get a little weird with this title.
And by weird, I mean possible reasons as to why we didn't get it in the United States, even though the arcade machine was released here, and the Genesis version was even advertised in the original marketing posters that were included with other Genesis titles. Note that it was the only game without a screenshot for some reason, and I think the no screenshot thing is probably why I remember being confused about it not coming out, because it stuck out on the poster. The cover on this version of the game features a dark-haired wrestler flexing in the center of the ring with the lights and ropes behind him, and the championship belt down below with the Wrestle War logo on the front. If I had to say he looked like someone, it would be former WWF champion Bruno Sammartino, but clearly a bit, shall we say, juiced. But actually, try to think about this picture for a second, but change the hair to blonde and add a mustache. That's exactly what happened with the Japanese cover, where Japan clearly didn't care about intellectual property at the time, and as a result, we get this cover instead, featuring a wrestler who's clearly supposed to be Hulk Hogan, down to wearing a bandana that says Titan Hogan instead of Hulk Hogan, and also featuring the Python Power slogan that the Hulkster used due to his 27-inch Python arms running wild on you. But the Japanese cover doesn't stop there, and instead of the arena lights, in the background there's other wrestlers, including Bruiser Brody, Stan Hansen, Road Warrior Hawk and Animal, Abdullah the Butcher, Jason the Terrible, and Mil Mascaras. Now, this is a cool cover, and I definitely think it's better than the European cover, except for the fact that legally it could never, ever be released as is in the United States, and I've got a feeling that Europe probably had those same concerns, hence the different cover. There's more to this that I'll get to in the review, but for now, flipping over the back, and, well, this is as plain as it gets. 4 admittedly decent screenshots with a single line of text. Body slams and backdrops, lariats and pile drivers. Be a part of the action with Wrestle War from Sega. I mean, yay? I know that they didn't have much room to work with due to covering 8 languages, but I think that copy was written in probably 30 seconds. Again, the rear cover for the Japanese version is much improved with a better screenshot-based layout and a first line that says, "This is Pro Wrestling, the champion of martial arts," which is 100% better than the English copy. Just don't ask about that second line. Opening up the package, and there's the manual and cartridge, and again, the manual is trying to cover 8 languages, so the layout is a bit annoying, but at least the Mega Drive manuals had black text rather than the Master System mimeograph purple, so it's easier to read. One thing with the wrestling games, there tends to be a lot of moves that you have to learn to be able to pull off, and thankfully there's a pretty thorough description here of which buttons do what, and then also bios for each of the wrestlers at the end. Okay, that's the package. Let's get in the ring and try to compete for the Sega Wrestling Alliance title. Before getting into the game itself, we should probably discuss the proverbial elephant in the room, and that's Wrestle War's various dances with copyright infringement, which more than likely stopped the game from being released in the United States, even if they had used the same edited cover that was used in Europe. Which, as you'll find out, doesn't even really make sense, as there's not anyone in Wrestle War that resembles that pictured wrestler. The first problem is the stable of wrestlers that's used in Wrestle War. When describing the Japanese cover, I called out a bunch of real-life wrestlers, and that's not by mistake, because those are the wrestlers included in the game, to some extent. The main character of the game, Bruce Blade, is reminiscent of Bob Backlund, complete with a pile driver in his offensive arsenal, strawberry blonde hair, and first and last name beginning with the letter B. But I could see non-fans not necessarily realizing who he's supposed to be. Then there's Mohawk Kid, who only has the most passing resemblance to Road Warrior Animal, and then Nimrod Falcon, who honestly could be any luchador, not just Mil Mascaras. But then things get into the obvious territory, with wrestlers like Don Dambuster, who not only looks exactly like Road Warrior Hawk, but also utilizes a military press slam and a knee drop, and Titan Morgan, who is the spitting image of Hulk Hogan, complete with guillotine leg drop finisher. Sega simply wasn't going to get away with having one half of the current tag team champions and the WWF World Champion included in the game, even with altered names. However, the copyright infringement issues don't just end with the game's roster. There's also the much more simple issue of the game's name, Wrestle War. Shortly after Wrestle War debuted in the United States arcades in April of 1989, the NWA began running an annual pay-per-view event called, Wrestle War, which continued until 1992 in WCW. Now, I'm sure if Sega really wanted to release Wrestle War in the US and was worried about litigation with WCW, they could have just changed the name of the game. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time a Sega property had a different name in the United States than other places around the world, but I'm sure the naming issues combined with the potential wrestler IP problems it just turned into a situation that was easier to avoid by canceling the release. Okay, now that all that's out of the way, let's discuss what you can actually do in Wrestle War. The game features two modes of play, single player and two player. Single player mode has you playing as wrestler Bruce Blade, as he's on the hunt to become the unified champion of both the Sega Wrestling Federation and the Sega Wrestling Alliance. SWA and SWF. I wonder how they come up with those names. Bruce is tasked with traveling around the United States and defeating 8 wrestlers, starting with Mohawk Kid. The next 5 bouts can take place in any order, with non-title bouts against Don Dambuster, Emerald Falcon, and Mr. J, and then also title matches against Sledgehammer for the SWF title and Titan Morgan for the SWA title. In a nice touch, if you win one of the titles, you'll hold up that belt at the end of the match, or both belts if you've beaten both Hammer and Morgan. After all those wrestlers have been defeated, you still have 2 matches left where you'll be challenged for your titles by Buckskin Rogers and finally Grand Kong. I like the ability to be able to customize your path to the titles, and working your way through the competition feels a bit like Street Fighter or other similar one-on-one fighting games, but as you might expect, other than potentially fighting everyone in a slightly different order, there's not a whole ton of depth here. Thankfully, there's also 2-player mode to extend the game's lifespan a bit. 2-player mode is exactly what it sounds like, with one catch. The first player always has to use Bruce Blade, but the second player can use anyone besides Bruce. This is a bit unfortunate because even though I'm sure you can have some fun mixing it up with a friend, the fact that someone always has to use Bruce is a little bit of a head scratcher. I'm going to assume it's some sort of programming limitation, and Wrestle War is certainly not the only fighting game that's like this, but it is a bit unfortunate from a gameplay perspective. Okay, so that's what you can do in the game, but how does the game actually play? Well, right off the bat, I should mention that as much as I enjoy the sport of pro wrestling, most of the time I don't enjoy pro wrestling video games. The reason for that is because most pro wrestling video games, at least the ones I've played, have a strong reliance on button mashing. And I don't just mean when you're being covered in a pin and are trying to mash away to get your shoulders up. I mean that button mashing is used anytime the wrestlers are competing for position in a clinch, which tends to happen a lot. I mean, you're not just going to be throwing punches and kicks the whole time. And let's face it, the various holds and throws and other moves make up a lot of the excitement of what goes on in a wrestling match. If someone just wanted to watch 2 people beat their brains in with punches the whole time, they'd watch boxing. And don't get me wrong, I get that there needs to be some way for the game to measure how effective you are at wrestling with the other person, so in that regard, whoever can mash their button the fastest can make sense to determine that. It's just not necessarily what I think of as fun when it comes to controls in a video game. Full disclosure, I wasn't a big fan of track and field or other games like that either. So when playing a new wrestling game, I'm always a bit apprehensive as to how that's going to go, with the worst case scenario being a game like 3 Count Bout on the Neo Geo, a title that I'm sure ruined many buttons in the arcades. Unfortunately, as soon as the game booted up, that did appear to be exactly what I was in for. The control scheme for the game is relatively simple, with the A button being used for punches, the B button being used for kicks, and the C button used to initiate a clinch, at which point you'll slam on either the A or B button, using the A button to try to initiate a Irish whip to set up more offense, or the B button to pull off a slam or a pile driver, depending on which wrestler you're using. The game has 3 difficulty levels, which helps somewhat with the button mashing, but even on easy, you're probably going to want to utilize a controller with autofire, and even then, don't expect to just walk through the end, as Grand Kong will still make you work for it. And honestly, that's about it. The gameplay definitely feels like an arcade wrestling title from the 80s, which I suppose is appropriate. And honestly, I do appreciate a wrestling game having controls that aren't overly complex, and I have to give them credit for not giving every wrestler the same moveset. But with Wrestle War, it's almost a bit too simple. The only thing you can do besides standard attacks and grapples is go to the outside of the ring, where it's a race to see who can grab the steel chair or emergency kit first. There's no climbing of the ropes, which admittedly was less common in the 80s, but more glaringly, there's no submissions. Fire Pro Wrestling, this is not. Along with not having an overly complex moveset, the game's actual movement is a bit strange. This mainly comes down to trying to replicate the design of the original arcade game, which was running on the slightly more powerful System 16 arcade hardware, but to throw an additional wrench into things, the arcade version of the game was set up for Tate mode, and if you don't know what that means, Tate is when the screen is rotated so that it's taller rather than wider. For the most part, the difference in orientation doesn't affect gameplay, as Sega moved the screen elements around to compensate, but there is an odd hitch in the Mega Drive version relating to when the screen flips. That might sound a little confusing, but essentially the game is designed to always have the first player in the lower portion of the screen and the second player in the upper portion of the screen. To achieve this, anytime a body slam, backdrop, or other type of move that would end up with the wrestler switching positions, the screen will flip to compensate. And while the arcade version handles this smoothly, the Mega Drive stutters when this happens, first when the screen flips, and then when the animation starts up again. It's nothing that ruins the game, and this usually only happens a few times a match to begin with, but it's definitely noticeable. Other than that though, Wrestle War as presented closely resembles the in-ring action of the arcade version, with these same large wrestler sprites from the arcade. It's not a perfect translation to be sure, and there is definitely less color and detail. The most notable change from the arcade is that any animation that isn't directly related to the two wrestlers is gone. The audience is no longer shown at the top of the screen, the cameramen are gone from the sides, and there's no longer a ref, at least not one that you can see. It ends up making the game look a bit plain if you're expecting the spectacle of the arcade version, but clearly sacrifices had to be made, and to give the developers credit, you simply didn't see sprites and characters this large on the console in mid-1991 for the most part. The sound in-game is a bit closer to the arcade than the graphics, but as you might expect, it's still a slight step down. It's not bad at all though, and honestly, if you weren't doing a direct A to B comparison between the two versions of the game, you probably wouldn't take note of the differences. The game's background music is similar to what's presented in the arcade, and changes up from match to match, so you're not hearing the same music the entire time you're playing the game, which is nice, even with the relatively short matches. The sound effects are a bit more limited to the music, but only because there are less of them, not because they're bad. And what's here does sound similar to the arcade sound effects. It would have been nice to have had some of the more variety that the arcade has, because hearing the same grunts over and over will get a bit old. But at least the intro speech of "Welcome to Wrestle War" was maintained, when usually digital speech is the first to go. Wrestle War is a good example of being one of the reasons why I love doing this channel, even though the game itself isn't exactly my favorite. I never got to experience the original arcade machine, and of course we didn't get the Mega Drive version in America, so I probably never would have played this game otherwise, much less seen it. Also, this is definitely a time capsule of a game in which it could only exist in the late 80s and early 90s, as it never would be released at all in 2025 just due to all of the changes with intellectual property protection over the last 35 years. However, having said that, the game still has its flaws, and as mentioned, I've never loved this style of game. As a result, I'm giving Wrestle War 2 stars. I definitely think it's worth checking out from a historical perspective, and despite the gameplay limitations, I'm sure it would make a fun afternoon of two-player action. Just don't go into things expecting any type of deep gameplay.
And that's it for Wrestle War on the Mega Drive. Now, I know there's some people out there that love this game, as they commented about it this past week in the run-up to the review, and I definitely wouldn't, specifically discourage anyone from at least trying it, but if I'm being honest, I would rather play one of the acclaimed WWF titles. And yes, I know that there's button mashing in those games too, but I had a bit more fun with those than this. Maybe it just depends on which games you grew up with, and as mentioned, I've never played the arcade version of Wrestle War either. They've got it down the road at Galloping Ghost, so maybe I need to go rectify that next time I'm in there. Next time on the channel, well, normally I try to only cover sports games when they're in season, but sometimes the schedule just doesn't always cooperate. However, in my defense, technically NBA Summer League just started up with the California Classic the other day, so I'm going to argue that if Summer League is in season, then the NBA is in season. Next week's title is a game that I have never played, although it's from a company where I've reviewed the previous 2 basketball games, hence the scheduling. This game has nothing to do with those previous 2 titles, and to emphasize that break, it's the first game from the publisher that was produced with an official NBA license. I'm very curious to see what kind of action is in store for me next week. Anyway, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 289. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.